There is a specific kind of frustration that does not have a name. Most people have felt it, but very few have understood it. It is the frustration of someone who knows exactly what they want, who can picture it clearly, who genuinely believes they are capable of it, and who still, despite all of that, does not move. Days pass. Weeks pass. The dream is still there, vivid as ever, and the distance between where they are and where they want to be has not changed at all. From the outside, this looks like laziness. From the inside, it feels like something far more confusing, because it is not laziness. Lazy people do not spend hours imagining a different life. They do not feel the specific ache of a vision they cannot seem to reach. They do not lie awake at night, running through everything they want to build and become. The person who dreams big and does nothing is not lazy. They are stuck in something much more specific. And until that something is named clearly, until the actual mechanism is understood, no amount of motivation, discipline, or better planning will close the gap. This video is about naming that mechanism, not to make you feel better about being stuck, but to show you precisely what has been happening, so that for the first time you can actually do something about it. Before we get to the mechanism, we need to look honestly at the experience itself, because most people who dream big and do nothing have tried to fix it. Multiple times, they have set goals, built plans, created vision boards, watched content designed to light them up and get them moving. And for a moment, sometimes hours, sometimes days, it works. The excitement returns. The clarity returns. The feeling of genuine possibility returns. And then it fades. Not dramatically, just quietly, like a tide going out. And they find themselves back in the same place, with the same dream, and the same distance between them and it. At some point, most people reach one of two conclusions. The first conclusion is that they do not want it badly enough. That if the desire were real, it would be producing action. And so they try to want it more. More visualization. More motivation. More content designed to make the dream feel urgent. The second conclusion is that something is fundamentally wrong with them. That other people have some quality, some capacity for follow-through, that they simply do not possess. Both conclusions are wrong. And more importantly, both conclusions make the problem worse. Because trying to manufacture more desire for a dream you already have is not the solution. And believing that you are constitutionally incapable of action is not just wrong. It is a belief that the brain will helpfully spend all its energy confirming. The real explanation is neither of these. It is simpler and more interesting. And it starts with understanding what the brain actually does when a dream becomes large enough to matter. The first thing that happens when a dream becomes genuinely significant is something almost nobody expects. The brain resists it. Not the way it resists something threatening or dangerous. More quietly than that. More strategically. To understand why, you need to understand one thing about how the brain works. The brain is not primarily a goal-achieving machine. It is a survival machine. And one of the things it works hardest to protect is something most people never think about: identity, the current, existing, established sense of who you are. Because identity is not just a concept. It is the brain's operating model for predicting how the world will respond to you, what you are capable of, what is realistic for someone like you, what outcomes you can reasonably expect. This model was built over years, through experience, through feedback, through the accumulated evidence of what happened when you tried things and what happened when you did not. And it works. Not perfectly, but consistently enough that the brain trusts it. Now introduce a large dream. a vision of a life that looks significantly different from the current one, a version of yourself that operates at a level your current identity has no established model for. And here is what the brain experiences: a threat, not to your physical safety, to the coherence of its operating model. Because the dream is implicitly saying, the current model is wrong, the current version of you is insufficient, and the brain's response to that implicit message is the same as its response to most threats: resistance. Not dramatic resistance, quiet resistance. The kind that produces a reason why today is not the right day to start. The kind that generates a need for more preparation before anything can begin. The kind that makes the gap between the dream and the current reality feel so large that attempting to close it feels unreasonable. This is not weakness. This is the brain doing exactly what it was designed to do: protecting the model, preserving the identity, keeping things consistent. The problem is that consistency and growth are fundamentally in tension. And without understanding this tension, without seeing it clearly for what it is, most people experience the resistance as personal failure rather than as a predictable biological response. And they try to push through it with more motivation, which the brain simply absorbs and then continues resisting. The second mechanism is more subtle and in some ways more damaging because it is disguised as productivity. Here is what happens in the brain when you plan. The same neural circuits that activate when you take action also activate when you plan to take action. The brain, in a neurological sense, does not clearly distinguish between doing something and vividly imagining doing it, which means planning produces a version of the same reward that doing produces: a sense of progress, a sense of movement, a sense of having engaged with the goal, without any of the actual work or risk of doing. This is not a design flaw. In many contexts, it is useful. It is why people can rehearse difficult conversations mentally and perform better in them. Why athletes who visualize performance show measurable improvements. The brain's inability to fully separate planning from doing has genuine benefits. But in the context of dreaming big and doing nothing, it is the mechanism that keeps most people permanently stuck in preparation. Because every time you plan, every time you map out the steps, refine the vision, organize the approach, the reward circuit fires. The feeling of progress arrives, and the urgency to actually move reduces. Not completely, but enough. Enough that starting feels slightly less necessary than it did before you planned. And then, the next planning session reduces the urgency slightly further. And the next one, further still. Until the person has an extraordinarily detailed plan and no action, and genuinely cannot understand why. Because the planning felt like progress. Because the brain experienced it as progress. Because neurologically, in a limited but real sense, it was progress. Just not the kind that closes the gap. Think about the last time you planned something significant. Not a casual plan, a detailed one, where you mapped out the steps, thought through the obstacles, got clear on what you would need. How did you feel afterward? For most people, the answer is better, more prepared, more in control, more confident that the thing is achievable. And how quickly did you act on that plan? For most people, the honest answer is not as quickly as the clarity warranted, because the clarity itself reduced the pressure to act. The gap felt smaller after the planning session, not because anything had actually changed, but because the brain had experienced a version of closure. This is the planning trap, and the people most susceptible to it are not disorganized or undisciplined people. They are the opposite. They are the people who take their dreams seriously enough to plan carefully, who are thorough enough to think things through before starting, who want to be ready before they begin. Their conscientiousness is being used against them. The third mechanism is the one that feels most like failure, but is actually the most understandable of the three. When a dream is large enough, when the vision of what you want to build or become is genuinely significant, something happens to the perception of the starting point. It becomes overwhelming, not because the first step is actually difficult, but because the brain is not looking at the first step. It is looking at the entire distance, the gap between where you are and where you want to be. And when that gap is large enough, it does not produce motivation. It produces paralysis. This is counterintuitive. Most people assume that a bigger vision produces more motivation, that the more compelling the dream, the more energy it generates. And this is partially true. At the level of inspiration, the dream feels exciting. The possibility feels real. But inspiration and action are not the same thing. And at the level of action, at the moment when the abstract vision has to become a concrete behavior, the size of the dream works against you. Because the brain is not comparing you to the dream. It is comparing the dream to you. And when the dream is large enough that the comparison produces a significant gap, the brain's assessment of the probability of success drops. And when the brain's assessment of success probability drops, the motivation to attempt drops with it. This is why people often feel most paralyzed around the things they want most. Not because the desire is insufficient, because the desire is so significant that failure feels unbearable. And the brain, which is always calculating risk, decides that not trying is safer than trying and failing at something that matters this much. The dream stays vivid, the action stays absent, and the person experiences it as a personal failure of will, rather than as a predictable response to the size of what they want. The fourth reason is perhaps the most socially acceptable of all, and therefore the most dangerous, because it does not look like avoidance. It looks like wisdom. It is the belief that the time is not right yet, that the conditions are not quite aligned, that there is something still missing, a resource, a circumstance, a level of readiness that will signal when the moment to begin has arrived, waiting for the right time. It sounds reasonable, responsible even, but in most cases it is something else entirely. It is fear wearing the costume of patience. Because here is what is actually happening beneath the surface of that waiting. The brain, which has already registered the identity threat, already felt the weight of the gap, has found an exit that requires no admission of fear. It does not have to say, "I am afraid to fail." It can say, "The timing is not right." It does not have to say, "I am not sure, I am capable of this." It can say, "I need to be more prepared first." And the most insidious part is that the waiting always comes with conditions that are just out of reach. When I have more money, when things settle down at work, when the kids are older, when I feel more ready, when I have more time. These conditions are not lies. They are real circumstances that genuinely exist. But they are being used as a reason to delay, rather than as a genuine assessment of what is actually required to begin. Because if you examine them honestly, if you ask whether those conditions are truly prerequisites for the first step, the answer is almost always no. The first step does not require more money. It does not require the kids to be older. It does not require everything to settle down first. The first step is available right now. The waiting is not waiting for the right time. It is waiting for the fear to go away. And the fear does not go away by waiting. It goes away, or more accurately, becomes manageable, through the one thing that waiting prevents: starting. The fifth mechanism is the one most people are proud of, which is what makes it so effective at keeping them stuck: perfectionism. Not the perfectionism of someone who produces exceptional work through relentless refinement. The perfectionism of someone who never produces anything because it is never quite ready to be seen. The logo is not finished. The plan needs one more revision. The idea needs to be clearer before it can be shared. The product needs to be better before it can be launched. The body needs to be in better shape before the photos can be taken. Each of these has the texture of high standards, of caring deeply about quality, of refusing to settle for mediocre work. And in small doses, in the right contexts, that is exactly what it is. But in the context of dreaming big and doing nothing, perfectionism is not a standard. It is a shield. It protects the dreamer from the one experience they are most afraid of: being seen, trying publicly, putting something real into the world, and finding out whether it is enough. Because as long as the work is not finished, as long as it is still being refined, still being improved, still being prepared, it cannot be judged, and if it cannot be judged, it cannot fail. The dream remains intact. The potential remains uncontested. The possibility that it could be extraordinary still exists. The moment the work goes out into the world, that possibility collapses into a specific reality. And the brain, which has been protecting the identity, managing the gap, avoiding the risk of failure at something that matters, finds perfectionism to be an extraordinarily effective tool for indefinite delay. Because unlike procrastination, which people feel guilty about, perfectionism feels virtuous. It feels like diligence, like respect for the work, like the opposite of laziness. It is none of those things when it is being used as avoidance. It is the most sophisticated form of not starting that exists. The sixth and final mechanism is the one that feels the most like action, which is precisely why it is so effective at replacing it: productive procrastination. The art of being extremely busy with things that are adjacent to the dream, without ever touching the core of it. The person who wants to write a book, but spends their evenings organizing their writing space. The person who wants to start a business, but spends their weekends consuming content about entrepreneurship. The person who wants to get fit, but spends 3 hours researching the optimal training program. The person who wants to build something meaningful, but fills every available hour with preparatory tasks that feel related, without ever beginning the actual thing. Productive procrastination is genius in its design. It satisfies the need to feel engaged with the goal. It produces a genuine sense of momentum. It allows the person to answer, "What are you doing toward your dream?" with a list of real activities, none of which are the dream. The research is not the business. The organized desk is not the book. The optimal program is not the training. The preparatory tasks are not the work. And the brain, which rewards the feeling of progress regardless of whether actual progress is occurring, is perfectly happy to keep generating that reward indefinitely, as long as the person keeps finding new adjacent tasks to complete, new things to learn, new systems to build, new preparation to do before the real thing can begin. The real thing never begins, because there is always one more preparatory task available. And the person who is busy with preparatory tasks is a person who never has to face the exposure of actually starting. 6 mechanisms: identity resistance, planning substitution, gap paralysis, waiting for the right time, perfectionism, productive procrastination. All 6 activated in various combinations at various intensities by the same underlying condition: a dream that is large enough to matter, a gap that is wide enough to feel significant. A brain that is doing its job of protecting the current model from the disruption that genuine change implies. And once you can see all six clearly, once you can name them in your own experience, something important shifts. The stuckness stops feeling like a character flaw and starts feeling like a solvable problem. Because it is. What actually moves people from dreaming to doing is not what most people expect. Not more motivation, not better planning, not a more compelling vision, not waiting until the fear goes away, not perfecting the work until it feels ready, not finishing all the preparatory tasks first, but simply a smaller starting point. Small enough that the identity threat is minimal. Small enough that the brain's success probability assessment stays high. Small enough that perfectionism has no material to work with. Small enough that productive procrastination cannot justify itself as preparation. Small enough that there is no longer a reasonable argument for waiting, just starting. This sounds simple. It is simple. But before you dismiss it, before the part of your brain that has been protecting you from the dream finds a reason to file this under things I already know, stay with it. Because most people here start small and think they understand what it means. They do not. Not fully. Because starting small is not just a tactic for getting things done. It is the specific mechanism by which the brain updates its operating model. And understanding how that update actually happens, step by step, layer by layer, is the difference between someone who starts small once and gives up, and someone who starts small and ends up somewhere they could not have imagined when they began. Here is what actually happens inside the brain the first time a small action is taken in the direction of the dream. The brain registers a completion. A loop was opened, an intention was set, and it was followed through. That loop closure produces a signal. Small, almost imperceptible, but real. The signal says, this person follows through on this kind of thing. It is one data point, one piece of evidence in a model that was built on years of contrary evidence. It does not change anything immediately. The identity does not update overnight. The resistance does not disappear. The gap does not suddenly feel smaller. But something has changed. One data point exists that did not exist before. One instance where the intention and the action were the same thing. The second small action produces a second data point. The third produces a third. And here is what the brain does with accumulating evidence. It begins to adjust its predictions. Not dramatically, not all at once, but incrementally. With each repetition, the brain updates its probability assessment slightly upward. This person follows through on this. The resistance, which was calibrated around the old probability assessment, begins to lower. Not because the dream has changed, not because the gap has changed, but because the brain's model of who you are in relation to this thing has changed. And a lower resistance means each subsequent action requires slightly less effort than the one before. This is the beginning of momentum. Not the dramatic momentum of a breakthrough. The quiet momentum of a brain that is slowly updating its model. And here is why this matters more than most people realize. Momentum is not just about making tasks easier. It changes what the brain anticipates. In the early stages, the brain anticipates discomfort when the work appears. It resists. It generates reasons to delay. It produces the familiar heaviness of something you are forcing yourself to do. But as the evidence accumulates, as the pattern of starting and completing repeats, the brain begins to anticipate something different. It begins to anticipate the completion, the signal that follows from following through. And anticipation of reward is what creates the feeling of wanting. This is the moment the shift begins to be felt from the inside. Not a dramatic transformation, just a quiet change in the feeling before the work begins. The resistance arrives later, leaves sooner. The starting feels slightly less like a decision and slightly more like simply what happens next. But something else is happening simultaneously, something deeper. Every small action taken in the direction of the dream is not just updating the probability assessment. It is updating the identity itself. Remember the first mechanism, the identity resistance. The brain protecting its current model from the implicit threat of the dream. Here is what the small actions are doing to that model. They are quietly rewriting it. Not through a declaration, not through a decision to see yourself differently, but through evidence. Real, behavioral, undeniable evidence that the current identity is no longer accurate. Because the current identity says, this person dreams and does not act. And the evidence says, this person acted. One instance, then 2, then 10, then 30. And at some point, the brain, which is always trying to maintain a coherent model, cannot hold both stories simultaneously. The old model and the new evidence are in direct conflict. And the brain resolves that conflict the only way it can, by updating the model. This is identity change. Not the kind that happens through affirmations or self-talk or deciding to believe something different about yourself. The kind that happens through repeated behavioral evidence that makes the old model impossible to maintain. And once that identity update begins, once the brain's model of who you are starts shifting from someone who dreams and does not act to someone who moves toward what matters, the relationship with the dream changes fundamentally. The dream is no longer a threat to the identity. It is an extension of it. The resistance that was generated to protect the old model has less and less to protect. And the gap, which once felt like an indictment of who you are, begins to feel like simply the distance between where you are now and where you are going. Distance, not impossibility. As the identity updates and the resistance lowers, something else begins to happen that most people who are still stuck cannot imagine from where they currently stand. The actions start producing visible results. Not immediately, not proportionally to the effort, but eventually, because small consistent actions compound. This is not a metaphor. It is the actual mechanism by which most significant outcomes in human life are produced. The first week of consistent small action produces almost nothing visible. The first month produces something, but something so modest it is easy to dismiss. The third month produces something that begins to feel real. The 6th month produces something that surprises you, and the 12th month produces something that would have been unimaginable at the beginning. Not because the actions got dramatically larger, because they kept happening. Because consistency across time is the variable that most people underestimate, and almost everyone underestimates because the early returns are so small. The early returns are designed to be small. They are not an indication that the process is not working. They are the process working exactly as it should. And every person who has ever built something significant, every person who looked back at a life that had genuinely changed and tried to identify the moment it turned, almost always points not to a dramatic event, but to the period when they stopped waiting and started moving consistently. Even when the movement felt invisible, even when the results were too small to justify continuing, even when every mechanism in this video was still present and still generating resistance, they moved anyway, and the movement compounded. There is a specific experience that happens somewhere in the compounding, and it is worth describing because it is the experience most people are waiting for before they start. They are waiting to feel ready, waiting to feel certain, waiting to feel like the person who is capable of the dream. And here is the truth about that feeling. It does not arrive before the movement. It arrives because of it. At some point, not at the beginning, not even in the middle, but somewhere in the sustained process of moving consistently towards something that matters. The person looks up and realizes something has changed. Not the dream, not the distance, but the person. The work that once required enormous effort now simply happens. The identity that once resisted the dream now generates behavior consistent with it. The gap that once felt like an accusation now feels like a journey. And the dream, which once felt like something that existed outside of them, belonging to a better version of themselves that did not yet exist, begins to feel like simply where they are going. Not a fantasy, a destination, one that is getting closer. Not because of a dramatic breakthrough, because of the accumulated weight of 1,000 small movements that individually felt insignificant and collectively became a life. The 6 mechanisms described in this video are not character flaws. They are not evidence of insufficient desire. They are not signs that the dream is wrong or the person is broken. They are the completely predictable response of a brain doing its job, protecting the current model, conserving energy, avoiding the risk of failure at something that matters. The brain is not your enemy in this. It is doing exactly what it was designed to do. The shift is not to fight it, not to override it with sheer force of will, but to give it something it can work with. Evidence that is small enough to accept. Actions that are consistent enough to update around. A starting point modest enough that the resistance has nothing to grab onto. Because a brain that has enough evidence that you move stops resisting the movement and starts expecting it. That expectation is what motivation actually feels like when it is real. Not the borrowed excitement of someone else's highlight reel. Not the artificial urgency of a deadline you set for yourself. Just the quiet, consistent pull of a brain that has learned, through your own repeated actions, that this is simply what you do. The dream has not changed. The distance has not changed. But the person standing at the starting point is different. And a different person at the starting point changes everything about what happens next. If you recognized something in this video, if any of the 6 mechanisms felt personally familiar, then you already know what to do. Not the full plan, not the complete strategy, just the smallest genuine action, the one that requires no preparation, the one that perfectionism cannot object to, the one that productive procrastination cannot substitute for, the one that is available right now. Start there. Not because it will feel significant. It will not. Not because it will immediately close the gap. It will not. But because the brain that takes that action is slightly different from the brain that did not. And the brain that takes it again tomorrow is slightly different still. And the brain that takes it consistently, through the resistance, through the paralysis, through all 6 mechanisms still present and still operating, that brain is quietly, invisibly, irrevocably becoming the brain of someone who does, and someone who does eventually arrives. If this made sense to you, you already know why you're here. We'll talk again.